Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to start Unit 7. In this unit, we're going to learn about a model of the entire economy called aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And then the second part of this unit, we're going to learn how we can fix the economy, or at least try to address some issues with it, using what's called fiscal policy. Before we're going to run, we're going to walk. Before we walk, we're going to crawl. And so today, we're going to begin to build the beginning of that aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So let's get started. Okay, so the first part up here just gives you the definition of what this thing called aggregate demand is. It's a relationship. Just as we said that demand in microeconomics was the relationship between how much people were willing and able to buy at a specific price, this is how much of everything people are willing and able to buy at all the price levels. So it's the relationship of what we would say is quantity of aggregate demand and price levels. And usually we're not going to be talking about quantity of aggregate demand, but the idea is that these are inverse, that as price levels rise, right, we would say quantity of aggregate demand falls and vice versa. And this relationship of everything people wanted to able to buy, we can quantify it by adding up actually all the spending in the economy. So this is the spending approach to GDP, but it's also how we know what goes into aggregate demand. It's consumption, investment, spending, government spending, and net exports. Now, this relationship, right, the inverseness of this relationship is true for a few different reasons. So there's several reinforcing factors that make it so that when we talk about aggregate demand, when we go to draw it, it'll be how much stuff we're willing and able to produce on the side-to-side axis, and that's we abbreviate as Y, right? You could also use GDPR if you wanted. GDPR for real GDP, that would be acceptable. GDP would not be, because we need to distinguish it the fact that it is real. So you can't just say GDP. You could write real output. That would be fine, but Y is sufficient for our purposes. Price levels goes on the y-axis, the up-down axis. And what we'll find is that aggregate demand is a downward sloping function. Now, that reflects that it's inverse, right? The amount of output that we're willing and able to buy is very, very large when price levels are very low, right? So if we said price levels are low, people are willing and able to buy this relatively large amount. When price levels are high, people are willing and able to buy a relatively small amount, right? A relatively small amount of output. And that's for a few reasons. Most of them should be relatively obvious, but I'm going to kind of explain them. You might see them in a multiple choice question or two. The first reason is that when price levels rise, like let's say you go from here, point A, to here, point B, from point A to point B, that means that prices are higher for everything. And it actually means that the value of our assets, that's the things that have value. So assets could include money even, right? Things that have value, assets include money, is less. The value of our assets is less. And that's because it can't buy as much, right? Our money can't buy as much stuff because prices are higher. As a result of us having less purchasing power, we would say that we buy less stuff. So that one's fairly straightforward. Your value of your money is decreasing, so you buy less. The second reason is called the net exports effect, and this one pertains to international trade. If the prices in your country are going up, right, so to be clear, this is domestic, right, this is just in your country, then we would say that you're going to sell less to foreigners and you're going to buy more from foreigners. And that's because your goods are relatively more expensive for them to buy because they're higher priced, and their goods are relatively cheaper for you to buy because they're lower priced. They haven't been subject to the same inflation. And as a result, you would have overall less quantity of aggregate demand, right, CIGXN. The third factor is something called the interest rate effect. This is that when prices are higher, people automatically won't save as much money. They will not. And the reason they don't is because they need that money to go buy stuff, right? And so they need that money to buy stuff. So at the very moment where you actually need more money, okay, there's less money in the banks for you to borrow because people aren't saving as much. So a lot of consumption is financed. A lot of this is via borrowing, right? There's a way to kind of say this. A lot of this spending is borrowed money. And so if the interest rate is higher, and we'd say the interest rate's going to be higher because people aren't saving as much, it's just the interest is the price of money. And so we'd say there's less supply of money to be loaned out, so it's going to be more expensive to borrow it. And as a result, people aren't going to borrow as much money, both because it's more expensive and there's less out there. And so that confluence of those factors means that we're not going to spend as much, right? And that's because we're not going to be able to borrow as much much because people who are savers are going to need that money for themselves. So, for a confluence of reasons, we would say that price levels cause a movement along or a slide along the aggregate demand curve. It does not shift the curve, right? Price levels don't shift the curve. But there are things that do increase aggregate demand. So an increase would be to the right, and we'll get to those in a second, and a decrease would be to the left. We'll get to those in a moment as well. But there are things that can change aggregate demand, but it's not no shifts from prices. Now, within the shifters of aggregate demand, it's actually any exogenous shift in CIGXN. So for the most part, you're looking for anything that would outside of prices, right? Outside any change other than price levels, right? Other than price levels, that's going to change aggregate demand. So, for example, one of the biggies is consumer confidence. Consumer confidence. And consumer confidence is just that. It's the confidence of your consumers. It's how sure they are about how well the economy is going to be. And so we could say if it increases, then C will increase. And if it decreases, C goes down. Like you're less confident, you're not going to buy as much stuff. Right? The real value of your assets, your real wealth, real and perceived wealth, right? So perceived wealth could affect your confidence as well. But if you are literally more wealthy, then you're going to consume more stuff. So if the stock market is going bonkers, that you may not even actually sell those shares and get that money, but it makes you feel wealthier, right? And even if you aren't fully invested in the stock market, so that can kind of bleed into consumer confidence a little bit. But if you legitimately have more wealth, you will consume more as well, right? So that's kind of another related factor to this. Indirectly, we would say taxes and transfers can indirectly affect C. And this is a little bit harder to wrap your head around, but it is only indirect. And this is the idea that if I tax you more, well, then you have less money, and so you can't spend as much. So consumption would go down, right? So just to kind of put that off to the side, if tax goes up, C goes down, right? Let's make that very clear. And if the transfers, on the other hand, if transfers go up, what would happen then? Well, C would go up. And that's because the government's giving you money to do something rather than taking it away, right? So these can kind of play a role in that. And then the last one is changes in the real interest rate, right? Changes in the real interest rate. And we'd say if I sub R goes up, it's more expensive to borrow. And so we would say consumption would go down. So I sub R means real interest rate, right? Real interest. And that's basically saying if the interest rate were to change outside of what we talked about up here, this would be real interest outside of the price levels. And there could be other reasons why the interest rate might change that's separate from, right, inflation. So this is kind of saying up here, these are all start with a change in price levels. There could be things that change how wealthy we are, right? But that maybe isn't necessarily starting from price levels. So, for example, if people are more wealthy because the stock market is booming, that would actually change consumption. But if people's perceptions or reality of their wealth is only being affected by inflation, then it's not, right? So, kind of the first event is what we're going to be focusing on here. Is the initial event, is it inflation? If it's a change in price levels, there's no change in aggregate demand. But there's these kind of other things that could affect it that aren't necessarily driven by price levels. Now, let's talk about investment spending. These are businesses predominantly that would make these decisions about investment spending. So we're going to say business confidence. And it's the same, it operates in the same way that consumer confidence does. If it goes up, then investment spending will go up. And that should make sense, right? If you're a business and you're more confident about the future, you're going to be more likely to buy the tools and equipment that you need to produce. But if you think the economy is going to go badly in the next year, well, then you're not going to spend that extra money you have on a new cash register or some new pizza ovens or what have you, right? You're going to kind of save onto your money. Another factor that could affect business confidence would be taxes and subsidies. So if these are business taxes and subsidies on capital or construction, right? So if it's stuff that would affect the kind of construction or purchases of new equipment, that could be affected, right? And it's, again, if it's a tax, there's going to be less. If it's a subsidy, there's going to be more. And then the third one here, we're going to say is changes in real interest rates. Changes in real interest rates. And this is if interest rates real go up, then investment spending goes down. And this is for the same reason that we set up here, changes in real interest rates. It's true up here as it is here. Businesses finance a lot of their spending through borrowed money. And if there's something that changes the interest rate that's not the prices, right? That it's not inflation, but there are other things that could change the interest rate. For example, if the central bank were to change the interest rate, right? The central bank being the Fed, they raise or lower interest rates, that has an effect on investment spending. And we're going to circle back to that one a lot, right? That this effect of the interest rate changing consumption and investment can be very, very big. And the last would be availability of new technology. I didn't spell that right. Availability of new tech or capital. And this is just saying that if there's a new tech released, right, like a new technology, we could say often investment spending will rise. Another way to say that would be if there's not much capital right now, then it can put pressure on investment spending to rise. So these are kind of two ways of saying, like, are there outside factors that might motivate businesses to buy more equipment, more tools, more machines? And so, for example, if there's a new technology that's released, that can often increase investment spending. Another thing that sometimes affects investment spending is what's our current stock of how much machines and tools and equipment, and what's our current stock of buildings? So a classic example of this is the housing market. If you have lots and lots of houses that have been constructed, right? New construction is part of investment spending. If there's lots of new houses and they're not selling, then you're not going to get very much new investment spending, because the businesses are going to look at it and go, why would I build more houses when there's already a ton of houses out there that aren't selling? And so that can cause a decrease in investment spending, because they look at it and go, I'm not going to build more houses, right? So if you don't have a whole lot of these new houses, or you don't have very much equipment, then that could lead to more. But if you have too much of this capital, if you just went through a buying spree and you just did a ton of buying of it, then you're not going to buy as much. G is very obvious usually when you see it. It's any changes in government spending or hiring. So it would be like the government spends more money on building a bridge or less. That would change aggregate demand. That one's pretty straightforward. And if they hire a whole bunch of people, that would increase aggregate demand. If they lay off government workers, that's going to decrease aggregate demand. So this one is a really usually pretty easy one to spot. The last one, XN. There are two things that can affect kind of our aggregate demand component of net exports. And one is the trade partner economic conditions, right? And this is saying if there's a recession in your trade partner, they're going to not buy your stuff. And so there's less XN for you. And there's less XN, we can say, therefore, aggregate demand goes down. So if your trade partner goes into a recession, then your aggregate demand could go down, right? So economies are often linked. They're linked together. Another way to think about that, if a trade partner puts in a trade barrier, like say a tariff, right? If there's a tariff, then they're going to buy less of your stuff, and so less XN for you. So aggregate demand can be affected by that. A way to think about that, if let's say a country imposes tariffs on imports, right? And let's say the United States imposes lots of tariffs, which has been in the news lately, then there will be greater XN because of fewer imports. And so that can lead to aggregate demand going up, right? So it really depends on kind of what that trade barrier looks like and whose perspective are we talking about, right? If the US is getting more net exports because we're not importing as much, then our aggregate demand would rise. So a big part of it is just remembering XN is part of aggregate demand. And if we've got more exports, there's going to be more aggregate demand. If there's more imports, there's going to be less. The second feature of XN is going to be exchange rates. This is probably the toughest one. We're going to return to this one in Unit 10. But in short, the version of this, if we think about when we go to buy something from another country, if we actually can buy their currency for cheaper, then by extension, you can buy their goods and services for cheaper. So if you are paying them in a currency and you can get more of that currency with your own, right, that their currency has become cheaper relative to yours, then you can actually buy more of their stuff. And so if your trade partner's currency gets cheaper, this is kind of what I just said, cheaper, then we would say their goods get cheaper relatively. And so that would lead to buying of their imports and less overall aggregate demand. And so your aggregate demand would fall. So if your currency, kind of the last thing I'll say here is we can write it out, gets cheaper, then we can say your goods are cheaper for foreigners. So by extension, right, foreigners, then your XN increases and aggregate demand goes up. So it's kind of a sequence of events here, right? Your currency gets cheaper, then your goods get cheaper for foreigners, then your XN rises. And this would be kind of the reverse of that statement, right? If your trade partner's currency gets cheaper, then your trade partner's goods get cheaper. And so you're going to buy more of their stuff and less aggregate demand. So these are two opposite statements of these. So as we kind of go farther in terms of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, you're going to get better at seeing the shifters of aggregate demand. The vast majority of the time, it's going to be something with C or I. And then when we go to fix it, it's going to be a change in G. So very often, G is how we fix the problem of maybe too much or too little aggregate demand. But the original problem is either going to be in the C or the I side. Maybe it might be an XN. All right. Hopefully this helped you understanding aggregate demand a little bit better. I'll see you next time.